Okay, we'd like to turn to the 77th Psalm. Psalm 77. We'll read the entire psalm. I cried unto God with my voice, even unto God with my voice, and He gave ear unto me. In the day of my trouble I sought the Lord. My sore ran in the night, and ceased not. My soul refused to be comforted. I remembered God and was troubled. I complained, and my spirit was overwhelmed. Selah. Thou holdest mine eyes waking. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. I have considered the days of old, the years of ancient times. I call to remembrance my song in the night. I commune with mine own heart, and my spirit made diligent search. Will the Lord cast off forever? And will He be favorable no more? Is His mercy clean gone forever? Does His promise fail forevermore? Hath God forgotten to be gracious? Hath He in anger shut up His tender mercies? Selah. And I said, This is my infirmity, but I will remember the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the works of the Lord. Surely I will remember thy wonders of old. I will meditate also of all thy work, and talk of thy doings. Thy way, O God, is in the sanctuary. Who is so great a God as our God? Thou art the God that doest wonders. Thou hast declared thy strength among the people. Thou hast with thine arm redeemed thy people, the sons of Jacob and Joseph. Selah. The waters saw thee, O God. The waters saw thee. They were afraid. The depths also were troubled. The clouds poured out water. The sky sent out a sound. Thine arrows also went abroad. The voice of thy thunder was in the heaven. The lightnings lightened the world. The earth trembled and shook. Thy way is in the sea, and thy path in the great waters, and thy footsteps are not known. Thou leddest thy people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. We see the inscription of this psalm is to the chief musician, to Jeduthun, a psalm of Asaph. 55 of the psalms are said to be to the chief musician. The name Jeduthun also appears in Psalm 39 and Psalm 62. And he is one of the musicians appointed by David. And we read of that in 1 Chronicles chapter 16 and 1 Chronicles chapter 25. Now Asaph, he's the author. And there are 12 psalms that are said to be authored by Asaph. Psalm 50, and then Psalms 73 through 83. 12. From 1 Chronicles chapter 6, verses 31 and 32, there was a number of Levites that King David assigned as leaders in song for the worship services in the tabernacles. And one of these men, 1 Chronicles 6, verse 39, was Asaph. And from 1 Chronicles 29:30, we see that Asaph was also a seer or a prophet. So the psalm basically is divided into two parts. You have first the distress and the doubt of the psalmist, Asaph. And that's recorded in verses 1 through 9. And then verses 10 through 20, you have Asaph remembering God's works, and he finds hope, and he finds assurance in his hour of despair. So we see that the psalm is both a psalm of lament and it is a psalm of praise. In the psalm, Asaph moves from hopelessness and despair to encouragement and healing. In the first part of the psalm, verses 1 through 9, it's almost like it's two different psalms. It's of completely different character from the second half of the psalm. When the psalmist reaches verse 10, and he says, "This is my infirmity," he's referring to his present state, which was a very distressful reaction to his present state. And he says, "This is my infirmity." But then the next word is "but." And that's the transition point of the psalm. And it is there that his lens has changed. It's still Asaph looking at his situation, but there's an adjustment, if you will, of the lens through which he is viewing the situation. And at that point, he is brought from despair to encouragement. So if you put the two divisions of the psalm side by side, in the one, verses 1 through 9, you see a man in agony, while in the other, you see great relief. He has found relief. Putting the two divisions of the psalm side by side, in the one, verses 1 through 9, you see a man who is almost completely lost his hold upon God and who has lost sight of God. While in the other part of the psalm, you see a man victorious against all this opposition. Putting the two side by side, the one in verses 1 through 9, you see a man in desperate need of comfort. A man who is in desperate need of healing of mind. And in the other, you see a man who has been transformed. A man who is being encouraged. In the first division, you see a man pouring out negative expressions. While in the second division, a man is pouring out positive expressions. Again, the situation has not changed. The situation's the same. The man is the same. He's just looking at it through a different lens. Again, both divisions, you have the same man's expression under the same set of circumstances. But putting the two together, you see in the one there is dissension, and in the other there is ascension. The first part, the man is going down. The second part, he's coming up. So you have two entirely different thought patterns. Verses 1 through 9, and then in the remainder of the psalm. Two entirely different perspectives. Two entirely different moods. Though, again, they are the words of the same man in the same circumstance. Things are different. The psalm highlights basically a journey from distress and questioning to finding hope and assurance. So I want to speak this morning on moving from despair to encouragement. We'll look at the first section of the psalm, which we see the psalmist is distressed and he is in doubt. The psalm begins, I cried unto God with my voice. And that is repeated for emphasis, even unto God with my voice. You say, well, that's a good thing. Yes, it is. The idea here, I cried unto God. It's a demonstrative cry. It's an earnest and fervent cry. I cried unto God with my voice. It's passionate. It's intense. It's emotional. It's something more than just words. And then Asaph declares, He gave ear unto me. So he says, I cried unto God, and I know that God heard me. And then in verse 2, he declares, in the day of my trouble. Trouble has reference to inward unrest, inward disturbance, a condition of distress, a condition of annoyance, a condition of difficulty and affliction, that which is very bothersome, that which is very stressful. And he says, in the day of my trouble, I sought the Lord. And that sought the Lord explains what he was doing when he cried unto the Lord. So there he is, crying unto God, seeking the Lord. But notice verse 2. My sore, which has reference to the trouble that he was feeling, ran in the night. Though I cried unto God, and I know He heard me, my trouble continued through the day and into the night, and ceased not. The trouble had not gone away. The trouble had not eased. There didn't seem to be any escape from the trouble. And this in spite of crying unto God, God hearing him, seeking God. And now he goes on to say, my soul, speaking of the depth of his trouble. The trouble had reached his soul. But notice what he says. My soul refused to be comforted. That is, he declined God's comfort. We've all been there. You have a trouble. You have an inward stress. God comforts you, but you ignore it. And the trouble continues. So he cried unto the Lord. He sought the Lord. And though the Lord heard him, there was no easing of his trouble. No quieting of his spirit. Then in verse 3, he said, I remembered God. He said, well, that's a good thing. Well, his memory wasn't right. He said, I remembered God and was troubled. That is, I remembered God and I was troubled by that. That is, I continued to be troubled. And then he says, I complained, and my spirit was overwhelmed, was covered with grief and sorrow. And he was feeling like he was being pressed down and ready to sink. So here's the situation. He has a trouble. He cries unto God. He knows God has heard him. And the more he thinks upon that, I cried unto God. Here I am in great trouble. God has heard me, but my trouble remains. And the more he thought upon that, the more troubled he became. So what you see here is he is stuck in gloom. He's not only stuck, but he's sinking deeper in the gloom. And in verse 4, thou holdest mine eyes waking. He's experiencing a sleepless nights. And he says, it's as if God is just holding my eyes open. I cannot sleep. And then he says, I am so troubled that I cannot speak. So we see him, he's agitated. And sleepless nights breeds agitation. He's agitated. He's so perplexed that he cannot even speak. In other words, he's become very sullen. And then in verses 5 and 6, he ponders and he remembers and he recalls earlier days and better times. He begins to think upon the good times he had in the past with God. He says, I have considered the days of old, the years of ancient times. I call to remembrance my song in the night. So now he's thinking of better times. I commune with mine own heart. Oh, that's most of the time is going to bring trouble. I began to talk with myself, and my spirit made diligent search. And I believe he slips into depression. And we base that upon the questions that begin to form in his mind. When he was communing with himself, trying to reason. I have this trouble. I've cried unto God. God heard me, but he hasn't done anything. I'm still in trouble. And he begins to reason this out in his mind. And these questions come to his mind. Will the Lord cast off forever? What's he doing? He's questioning the faithfulness of God. And will he be favorable no more? Is his mercy clean gone forever? Doth his promise fail forevermore? Hath God forgotten to be gracious? Hath he in anger shut up his tender mercies? So these are the assumptions that he's beginning to form in his mind. And as you read those questions, you can feel his distress. And you can feel the doubt that he has and the agony of these questions. He's in a terrible state of mind at this point. When you begin to question God's faithfulness, your mind's not right. You're in a terrible state of mind. But then you come to verse 10, which introduces the second portion of the psalm. And it's here that the psalm pivots. Listen to what he says. And I said, this is my infirmity. The word "this" refers immediately back to his attitude of gloom, to his doubtfulness of God. And it refers back to his condition of mind. And he refers to this condition, my infirmity. This, the way I'm thinking right now, is my infirmity. The word infirmity refers to a disorder, refers to disease. It's frailty. It's frailty of mind. And it is the infirmity of every one of us. When Asaph says, "This is my infirmity," every one of us can say the same thing. This mindset that we see in verses 7 through 9. This is my infirmity. This is my disorder. This is my weakness. My mind. My thought process. But then notice what he says. But, in spite of my infirmities, he says, I will. And you read verses 10 through 12. 4 times he says, I will. It's personal resolve. It's personal resolve in spite of his infirmity. Yes, I have this weakness. I have a weakness in my mind. I have a problem with my thought process. But I'm not going to get stuck there. I will. There's resolve. 4 times. I will. I will. I will. I will. That's desire to rise above his infirmity. 4 times. I will. And each time, it is I will in relation to the Lord. So hear him. I will remember. To remember is to keep something in the mind, which explains his infirmity. It is to keep something in the mind. He said, I will remember the years of the right hand of the Most High. He says, I will keep in my mind God's abundant grace, God's abundant mercy and love. I'm going to keep that in my mind. I'm resolved, because that's his infirmity, is his mind. And then he goes on and he says, I will remember, again, to keep something in the mind, the works of the Lord. God's doings. And then, surely, I will remember thy wonders, thy marvels of old. So 3 times he says, I will remember in relation to the Lord. So what we have here is an adjustment of mindset. It is now a mind, in the beginning of the psalm, he has this trouble. He cries unto God, good thing. He seeks God, good thing. He knows God has heard him, good thing. Bad thing, all of this troubles him. And he begins to question God's faithfulness. I've done everything that I should do. And yet my trouble still remains. And then his thought process gets skewed, and he brings more trouble into his life. We've all been there. So in the first part of the psalm, the mind of Asaph, very much distracted, very clouded, his mind is working against him. We are depraved. And our mind will work against us. Our mind will work against us, which increases our troubles. And we refuse God's comforts. That causes us sleepless nights. And we become filled with doubt. And now you're in a cycle. You're just going round and round and round. His mind is acting against him, acting against his own good. And this is an infirmity. And it's the infirmity, it's not the only infirmity we have, but it is the infirmity of us all. But then he is resolved for his mind to be right. But I will remember. That is, I will keep in my mind His grace, His mercy, His love. I will keep in mind His wondrous works. And then in verse 12, he goes on to say, I will meditate also. Also is in addition to keeping these things in my mind, I will meditate also upon these things. I will meditate also of thy work. Of thy work. That is, there's a shift now in the activity of his mind. The mind's always working. It's always working. It's always active. And the activity of our mind is of extreme importance. And he said, I will meditate in this. That is, this is going to be the activity of my mind. I'm going to keep it in my mind, and now I'm going to meditate upon it. What is in the mind will determine the activity of the mind. And the activity of the mind will determine the activity of life. Now notice what he says. This is my infirmity, but, and then he says, I will meditate, but then notice, talk. That's physical activity. Talk of thy doings. So there's a shift in his mind. There's a shift in the activity of his mind. There is a shift in the activity of his life. I will remember, I will meditate, I will talk. So, all the importance of the mind. Of the mind. What has taken place in these verses is 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5. In those verses, we are reminded that we do not war after the flesh, and that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. And he goes on in verse 4 of 2 Corinthians 10, and he mentions strongholds. That is, fortresses, barriers, impediments. And in verse 5 of 2 Corinthians 10, we see where these strongholds are erected. They are erected in the imaginations and thought. The imaginations has reference to wayward, contrary to God, speculations, ideas, opinions, reasonings, theories. And then there's the word thought. Mental purposes and plans, contemplations that are contrary to God. It is in our minds. Every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, he says there. In our minds, barriers against God. And these things are erected. They're strongholds. They're fortresses. They can be erected in many different ways. There can be many methods of erecting them. Most of them we build ourselves. We're very good at building strongholds and barriers in our minds against our own good, against our own welfare. The mind is a major battlefield. In all battles, there's going to be significant battlefields. It's no different spiritually. And the mind is a major battlefield. It is a wrong state of mind that hinders so many spiritually. You think something long enough, you make an assumption long enough, it becomes fact to you. It's not fact, but it is to you. Your mind is working against you. Our spirituality has much to do with our thought patterns. And our thought patterns have much to do with our spirituality. We read in 1 Peter 1:13, gird up the loins of your mind. That is, keep your mind ready. Keep your mind prepared. Ready and prepared for God. Keep your mind. Gird up the loins of your mind. That is, give attention to how you think. Give attention to how you think. There is such a thing as biblical thinking, biblical logic. Most are strangers to it, but it's very real. Remember, we gird up the loins of our mind. We keep our minds not in the strength of the flesh, not with earthly weapons. It's through Him. So what takes place in this portion of the psalm, beginning with verse 10, is what we read in 2 Corinthians 10. It is the pulling down of mental strongholds. We built them. There comes a time you better pull them down. You better pull them down. It is 2 Timothy 1 verse 7. A sound mind. What is a sound mind? It's a healthy mind. It's a sensible mind. A healthy mind is a sensible mind. It's a morally strong mind. 1 Peter 3 verse 1 we read a pure mind. It's free from mixture. You see, Asaph, he cried unto God. We'll assume that his mind was pure at that point. He knows God has heard him. We'll assume that his mind is still pure. There's no mixture. But then he begins to think. Still in trouble. Nothing's changed. And begins to question God. Well, now his mind is no longer pure. There's other things that have come in. Better be careful what comes in. What comes in. A pure mind. It is here at verse 10 that Asaph begins to think right. And what is the root of right thinking? Well, it's faith. Romans 12 verse 3 says, think soberly. That is, think clearly. Think in an unclouded way, according, that is, in harmony, as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith. Think soberly. Think clearly. And then you have faith. There's a direct correlation between thinking soberly and faith. The way to think right is faith. And what does faith do? Faith looks away from self to God. Faith sees God. That's thinking right. Thinking right is moving away from yourself to God. Not getting stuck on the trouble, whatever the trouble is. It's looking away from that unto God. That's faith. That's thinking right. Faith is dependence upon God. Faith is reliance upon God rather than self. That's right thinking. Faith is trust and confidence in God rather than self. Faith is leaning upon God rather than self. Faith is letting go and seeing God rather than self. In all of those statements, it is God rather than self. That's right thinking. That's right thinking. That's faith. And this is what takes place in verse 10. There is a shift from self to God. Now notice, in verses 10 through 20, the emphasis has changed. I will remember the works of the Lord. I will remember thy wonders of old. I will meditate also of all thy work and talk of thy doings. You have, verse 11, the Lord. You have the pronoun thy. You have it again in verse 12, or verse 11 and verse 12. Verse 13, thy way, O God. This leads him to not the questions he was asking in verses 7 through 9, where he's questioning the faithfulness of God, but he now says, who is so great a God as our God? Quite a change from verses 7 through 9. His mind is right. And then he says, thou art the God that doest wonders. Notice it's present tense. First part, remember, I will remember. I call to remembrance my song in the night. He's looking back in the past. And now he's thinking of the present. First section, he comes to a point where God's in the past. Good spiritual times are in the past. But thou art the God that doest wonders. Thou hast declared, or thou hast demonstrated thy strength. among the people. Thou hast, with thine arm, redeemed thy people. He personifies the Red Sea. He says, the waters saw thee, O God. The waters saw thee. They were afraid. Then he goes on in verse 17, he mentions thine arrows, the voice of thy thunder. Verse 19, thy way is, thy path, thy footsteps. Thou leddest thy people. What has happened? Asaph has risen above. He's been lifted above self. He's been lifted above his circumstances. And God is his focus. His troubles haven't changed. Well, they have to some degree, but his circumstances, he still has the trouble. But his lens is different. And if his lens is different, his mind is different. How he sees things is different. So how he thinks about things is different also. That's always true. That's always true. We get stuck. We think. Culture is a great determiner in the lens in which we view things. We have lived our entire lives in the United States, and we view things through that lens. It's just the way it is. I'm not condemning it. I'm not saying that, that's the way it should be. That's just the way it is. You take somebody in Brazil, Cuba. They're the same age as you, but their lens is entirely different. It's an entirely different lens. You have two separate lives, two separate cultures. The lens is different. How they think is different. We have the tendency to say, well, whatever my way is right. Well, it's right to you through that lens. Their way is wrong. Well, they say their way is right, and your way is wrong. But it's all lens. But spiritually, we must look through the lens of God and not self. Because I promise you, if all we do is see spiritually through the lens of self, you will be wrong every time. Your view of things will be wrong. Your perspective is wrong. Everything is wrong. You think wrong. We need to have a correct lens. We need to look away from self unto God. And Asaph, and God help us, Asaph was lifted above his distress. And let's just be honest, we bring much of our stress upon ourselves. Yes, distress can come from outward sources, but then the way we react to the stress, guess what? Adds to the stress. And now most of the stress we have is self-induced. So we have to be careful. How do we look at things? Spiritually. I'm talking spiritually. Through the lens of God or through the lens of self. And that will determine how we think. And how we think will determine how we live. Brother Stephen, if you'll come and lead us in verse of song, and let's all stand and Stephen.